The next day, May 31st, at 7 a.m., they assembled us for departure to the trenches. Noisy demonstrations resulted. Cries, songs, shouts, whistling. Of course, the Internationale was heard. I truly believe that if the officers had made one provocative gesture, said one word against the uproar, they would have been massacred without pity, so great was the agitation. They chose the wisest path, waiting patiently until calm was restored. You can't cry, shout and whistle forever, and among the insurgents there was no leader capable of taking decisive direction. We ended up heading for the trenches, not without an undertone of griping and grumbling. Soon, to our great surprise, a column of mounted cavalry came up and rode alongside us. They accompanied us all the way to the trenches, like convicts being led to forced labour. Annoyed and suffocated by the dust kicked up by the horses, we didn't have to wait long before scuffles broke out between foot soldiers and cavalrymen, and then some brawls. There were even a few blows from rifle butts on one side, and from the blunt sides of sabres on the other. To prevent a real battle from breaking out, they had to move the cavalrymen farther away, which wasn't at all disagreeable to them. We passed through Moiremont, the final inhabited and civilized place, then Vienne-la-Ville and Vienne-le-Château, two good-sized villages in ruins. 300 metres from what had been the village of La Harazie, in the smiling valley of the Biesme River, we relieved the gunners of the 358th Regiment. We set ourselves up in a veritable little fortress, situated on the flank of a valley, facing the enemy. In the underground galleries and rooms we could withstand any bombardment, having 100 metres of bedrock above our heads. At the ends of two embrasures, two fixed pivoting naval guns aimed their menacing muzzles at the facing slopes and the ravines which opened into the valley. The Germans were only a kilometre from our fort, but they couldn't see it because of the oak and pine woods which still covered the steep slopes facing them. The entrance to our fort and the terrace in front of it, built in stone and earth excavated when it was dug, were masked from our counterparts, the Kaiser's gunners, by thick bushes and branches which we often had to replenish so that they mingled closely with the surrounding greenery. Well installed on this terrace for our meals, card games, letter writing, etc., we spent happy and peaceful days there. Below us, a forest with its green and aromatic carpet of flowers, verdure, wild strawberries and raspberries. Hundreds of birds, drawn by our breadcrumbs, dazzled us with their chirping and twittering. A couple of wrens were bold enough to build their nest in the greenery surrounding the embrasure of one of the naval guns. Beasts and soldiers are made to get along. But what a contrast! The grace, the gaiety of these little birds, right next to a horrible instrument of death. To remind us that the war wasn't yet finished, the Germans occasionally sent some volleys of shells into the Biesme Valley, which obliged us, readers or card players, to flee into our fortress, like mice chased by a tomcat. It's also true that once night fell, our neighbours across the way brought up machine guns onto the colossal plateau over by the Fort de Paris and swept the valley, which they had in enfilade, and sometimes bullets came and ricocheted off our fortress. But apart from these little inconveniences, which an ambuscade would perhaps have found terrifying, we considered ourselves very lucky and our fate made others jealous. In case of an enemy attack, we were supposed to hold until the assailants crossed the Biesme, then blow up the works and make our getaway by an underground passage which let out near the summit of the escarpment. That part of the sector was deserted, and no one except us knew about it or poked around this hidden passageway. One warm July afternoon, we were all out on the aforementioned terrace of the fort, enjoying ourselves loudly, reinforced by a couple of watchers from a nearby surveillance post. 3 or 4 parties of Boer or Manille card games were underway, and a few containers of pinard from the local wine growers' co-op had served to loosen our tongues, southern tongues so clear and sonorous that you'd have thought yourself on the barques in Narbonne, a riverside promenade, or along the banks of the Garonne in Toulouse. Bareheaded, in shirt-sleeves, untidy, we were taking our ease when we heard, first in the emergency passageway and then inside the fort, loud voices and a racket. In the darkness inside, someone was crashing and stumbling around. "Who is there?" cried Simard the Toulousan. But at that very moment, in the entrance to the fort which opened onto the terrace, two men appeared, their uniforms splattered with mud. The first of these two men was a junior cavalry officer. He stepped aside, and then there appeared before our bewildered eyes our divisional general, Elie de Boisière. If we'd seen the Kaiser himself appear before our eyes, we wouldn't have been more surprised. The general, who had by chance discovered the outlet of our escape route, not knowing where it led, seemed as stupefied as we were. There was a minute of heavy silence, broken by the dry voice of the general. "Who commands here?" he said. The commandant of the fort stood up. His heart was in his boots, this commandant, who was none other than my comrade Sergeant Gautier. "It is I, General," he stammered. "What's going on here?" For better or worse, more worse than better, the sergeant tried to explain. The general wasn't happy with these vague explanations, and he wanted to know in detail the calibrations of each artillery piece, the distances, the instructions, the reference points, etc. The sergeant began by mumbling and stammering, but I came to his aid by presenting to the general the panoramas, firing tables, etc., that I had drawn myself and which I had quickly taken down from the walls. That way he could realize the importance of our post, from which, in a minute, we could open fire on any point in front of us. The general appeared satisfied. He looked at us for a moment longer before leaving, and shaking his head he said to us, "You're like coqs en pâté. You're in clover, you're sitting pretty." So the Harazzi sector was a calm one, a place of repose, which only rarely was honoured by mention in dispatches. Its tragic, celebrated hour in 1915 had almost been forgotten, the time when terrible combats bloodied this poetic corner of the Argonne. The army of the German Crown Prince had given us a real kick in the butt there. Sweeping down the valley from the Fontaine aux Charmes, the Germans had even occupied La Harazzi, but a French counterattack pushed them out of it. You could still see the shell of a fine house where the Crown Prince had set up his command post. He was almost collared there by our boys, and owed his salvation to a little door in the rear by which he could flee. The storm of these fierce combats having passed, the front line was set for the next few years, 700 metres from the village. The only reminders of the fighting were a few grassy corners transformed into cemeteries, and our dead took their final repose there, in the shade of the lindens, willows and pines, soothed by the soft murmur of the Biesme. La Harazzi had kept its village-like appearance. The walls of its little church and a few houses were still standing, since the shells reached them only with some difficulty, the village being strung along the steep slope of the valley. Among its ruins you could make out the walls of a villa, the country house where the academicienne André Touriette, I was told, came to vacation and to breathe the vivifying air. In the shade of a linden tree, I've written these lines while sitting on a stone bench, where perhaps the gifted writer himself wrote those books which tell about the surrounding countryside. One of his books plays out its whole plot in the setting of the Biesme Valley. At La Harazzi, a rivulet of pure crystalline water, which nourished Thuriet's garden, flows into the Biesme. It's the water from the Fontaine aux Charmes. This spring was now behind the German lines. At long intervals, on signs nailed to the trunks of pine trees, you could read the words, "Drink at own risk." We stayed in this sector nearly 6 months. There was never any serious business here, no mine explosions or gas attacks. This tranquility was troubled only by some coups de main, trench raids, by one side or the other, which made more noise than they did any harm. But what is a trench raid? Any poilu knows about them. But how many civilians have an even approximate idea what they were? Damn few, I'd say. Their ignorance is excusable, because all the accounts, official or unofficial, even those recounted or written by those who took part, have led them down the wrong path. They talk or write only things that shine light on the courage, the heroism, the disregard for death shown by the French soldier. They're silent about anything that could diminish his glory, his beauty, his valour. One lies, or if you will, one alters the truth for patriotic reasons, just as one kills or one lies, for reasons of state. First of all, it is generally thought that these trench raids were carried out by elite soldiers, who combined the virtues of a warrior with those of an exemplary citizen. That's the first big error, with few exceptions. These heroes were hard cases, unruly, and often had police records which were far from unblemished. But, you might say, it's surprising that rascals like these would be able to carry out actions requiring great sang-froid and solid courage. Hold on before deciding. These guys were picked for their weak points. They were obsessed with independence, so the straitjackets of their discipline were loosened a few notches. Drunk with liberty, they suffocated in the trenches, so they were pulled out and billeted at divisional depots in the rear, and came to the front lines only a few hours before the appointed time of the raid. At the depot, they were free to have fun, sing, brawl, make a racket, dine, quarrel, brawl among themselves. They were left alone. Relegated to separate barracks, they were treated as indulgently as others were treated severely. They were compensated each time with a few croix de guerre, which they were crazy about, and a 4 or even 8-day leave for each one, if the group brought back just one prisoner, which was rare. The day came for one of these adventurous excursions to visit Monsieur les Boches. The volunteers were brought up in automobiles or vans close to the trenches, and during the night they installed themselves right up at the forward posts from which they would move out. Passages through the barbed wire would have been cut in advance, just beyond the forward posts. This was generally done at the first glimmers of dawn's light. The silence was suddenly broken by the distant firing of a large-caliber artillery piece. This was the signal. The echo wouldn't have finished reverberating through the valleys and ravines before all the batteries of the sector and of neighbouring sectors opened up a rolling fire on the point that was going to be attacked. At the same time, all the trench artillery, mortars, bomb-throwers, 37mm cannon, Stokes guns, etc., spit out iron and fire on the enemy's forward posts and beyond. And all this deafening racket was unleashed at one time, as if a single hand had fired 100 cannon blasts at once. The volunteers, piled up in a boyau, their stomachs well fortified with wine and hooch, threw themselves forward at the first cannon shot. The first ones out carried clusters of branches on their heads. Arriving at the Boche barbed wire, the first one tossed his branches and stepped aside. The second climbed onto the first cluster and threw his own ahead, and so forth until they reached the enemy's forward post in 2 or 3 minutes. But while all this was going on, what were the Germans doing under this deluge of iron falling upon them like an avalanche? They had a clever tactic. In their forward listening posts they left just 2 men, whose mission it was to fall back at the first cannon shot, not to the front lines, which were completely deserted, but to the second lines, organised for a solid resistance, and which would have been too rash for us to attack. These forward sentinels, if they hadn't been blown to bits right at their posts, would fall into our hands only if they were wounded while falling back. Sometimes they disappeared into underground mines or saps linked up by galleries. Most of the time the raiding party ended up empty-handed. To the French general who waited impatiently at the colonel's command post, the raiders brought back only a pick or spade with the handle broken off, or a tarpaulin or tent cloth picked up in the German trenches. Eyeing these meagre trophies, the general would furrow his brow. "And the prisoners?" he would say. With admirable accord, everyone swore that the Boche simply wouldn't surrender, and they were forced to kill every last one of them. Sometimes they actually succeeded in capturing 1 or 2 who were good enough to surrender. That was a real triumph. That meant 4 days or maybe a week of leave, starting that very evening. The giddy general would distribute cigarettes, vintage wine, croix de guerre, etc. One day they brought back a prisoner, while the men of the raiding party crowded around the general who probed them about the perils of the raid. A junior officer who had not been on the raid approached the Boche, insulted him, and threatened him with a clenched fist right in his face. A couple of the volunteers spotted this and shouted at the officer. They didn't want him to touch their prisoner. "He's ours," they said. "You didn't bring him in, did you?" And the dumbfounded prisoner found himself plied with cigarettes, coffee, wine, hooch, etc., right in front of the offending officer, who only could stand there in complete silence. These raids had diverse results. Some had tragic outcomes, others were more like burlesques, bordering on the ridiculous. Sometimes it happened that the volunteers, completely drunk, would start arguing, get into brawls, and even wound each other, right in the boyau as they prepared to go over the top, or when they were out on their way to the attack. There were also mad panics, groups which wandered off and got lost in the tangles of barbed wire. The Boches would never know what happened, but our general would get a full and detailed account of the successful action. Finally, the general, a bit sceptical, decided that the raids would take place in broad daylight. But this brought no better results, and so they went back to the pre-dawn hours. To be fair, it must be noted that at least one time, the volunteers showed some real courage. Reaching the German trenches, they ran smack into an enemy raiding party, which, by bizarre coincidence, was heading for our lines to grab some prisoners. A frightful hand-to-hand combat ensued, and our heroes emerged victorious, killing or chasing off their adversaries. That's what the raids were all about, so fashionable at the time, and just who they were who carried them out. Some of the raiders were ragged, untidy, like scarecrows. Others were perfumed dandies with long hair, strutting around, indulging in wild bits of apparel for which they sacrificed all economy. What role did our unit play during the 6 months we were in the sector? First of all, our unit was sharply reduced in size. 2 men had to leave for the army of Salonika, another was sent off to be a miner, and a 4th to be a truck driver. There was hardly anyone left at the front but the riffraff of peasants, guys with dirt between our toes. Comrade Delisle had written to his wife and told her about the anti-militarist demonstrations back in June. To teach him to be a little more discreet next time, they sent him off to the divisional disciplinary company. A third of those who remained left us to go to form a divisional battery of the new English cannon called Stokes. But the more they shrunk us, the more they increased the number and the variety of hardware to be employed. 3 37mm guns, 1 revolver cannon, 4 Brand compressed air mortars, 3 47mm naval guns. In brief, there were more cannons than cannoneers, but our duties nonetheless were not very difficult. On the front line there was only 1 revolver cannon and 1 Brand mortar, served by 4 gunners. The others were in reserve in case of attack, in the fortress studded with our 5 cannons and some machine guns manned by territorials, who occupied a part of the works. For the trench raids, which became a nightmare for us, you had to go up to the front line, sometimes as far as the farthest outposts, with our whole arsenal. We had to fire madly all the while that the raid lasted, for 15 to 20 minutes, and then quickly scramble to find the nearest shelter, because the volleys of 77mm or 105mm shells soon came crashing down upon the communication trenches. Our commanding officer, who had served in the artillery, estimated that each trench raid cost, in shells alone, from 300,000 to 500,000 francs, and for what result? Grabbing 1 or 2 prisoners, pulverizing a sentry. What a waste! But what did money mean to our leaders, for our generals? Germany would pay it all back one day, or the French taxpayer would. There were, in history, the Red Terror and the White Terror. Now you can add the militarist terror. The first made use of the guillotine, the second employed the knife to teach people how to live. The third used penal companies and the execution post for those who didn't toe the line. The stirrings of revolt, which manifested themselves in May and June in various units, had incited our bosses to impose more harsh and severe discipline, we soon noticed. For some time, most of our mail was opened. Woe to one who voiced approval of the demonstrations, who said he was tired of the war, or who made some other imprudent comment. One subversive word and it's a court-martial, or at least a couple of months of vacation in one of the penal or special companies, which had been hastily put together within each division. No one could be out on the roads, which were lined with gendarmes, without authorization signed by the colonel. Those going on home leave from the front lines were escorted to Saint-Menehould like dangerous convicts. We had to march in ranks of 4, on the road, as if in drill, bracketed front and rear, and on the side by non-coms. As far as Moiremont, the leave-takers were led by junior officers from the lines. From there, non-coms also going on leave took command of the troops under their charge. It was absolutely forbidden to sing, even La Madeleine, to break ranks, or to stop individually, even to tie a shoelace or obey a call of nature. Either the whole column had to stop at once, or a corporal had to stay behind with the laggard. In other circumstances, there would have been grumbles and even violent outbursts. But to go on home leave, to escape this atrocious life for just a few days, to see loved ones, we would have walked barefoot, we would have crawled on our knees, we would have endured the kicks of boots and the lashes of riding crops and whips. From La Harazie to Saint Menehould, there were beautiful cherry trees all along the road, almost without interruption, and their interlacing branches formed a fresh arbour over our heads. In June and July, these trees were covered with beautiful cherries, red, white, golden, multicoloured. But in yet another torture of Tantalus for the leave-takers, there was hell to pay if you got caught pulling down a branch full of cherries. 3/4 of the fruit rotted on the tree, but too bad for the poilus. That would teach them, once again, not to sing the Internationale. Once we reached Saint Menehould, they kept us from passing through the middle of town. If we had been lepers, they couldn't have done a better job of preventing any contact between us and the civilian population. We therefore made a big detour, which allowed us to admire the military cemetery where several thousand heroes were buried. Then we reached the barracks outside of town, where a big iron gate closed right behind the last of the leave-takers. We were prisoners, right up to the time the train left, and then we marched no farther than 2 kilometres from town before getting onto the train, in the middle of the woods. The return worked the same way. To organise this procedure and to ensure its smooth operation, if one can call it that, they put in place at Moiremont an officer superior in rank if not in qualities. It was a commandant whose name escapes me. In civilian life, he was probably director of an insane asylum or a camp of convicts. This officer, already on horseback at dawn, scoured all the roads in the sector which brought leave-takers back, from morning to night, and fell upon them like a thunderbolt, counting heads, trying to catch them in some misstep. Watch out, squad leader. The slightest infraction of the rules would lead to your being broken in rank, with no chance for appeal. Every day he had to claim at least one victim, as testimony to his vigilance. It mattered little that the soldier or the non-com was a model of courage or bravery. There was no recourse. They needed to make examples. They needed to terrify. On the day I was leaving for my 4th home leave, we were approaching Saint Menehould when one of us stopped to take a leak, then tried to catch up with us. But the terrible commandant surprised him before he regained his place in the ranks. The situation was very serious, as you will see. A Fourier, quartermaster sergeant, was leading us. He was slapped with 8 days of probation. His home leave was suspended, and he could say goodbye to the sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. The unlucky Fourier tried to explain that he had authorized the man to stop, simply exercising his rights as squad leader. But the strongest always wins every argument, and the commandant stuck to the punishment he had handed out, calmly warning the non-com not to risk making things worse by protesting further. This damned commandant accompanied us to the barracks, making us keep in formation and step out like new recruits on the drill field. But once our ranks were scattered, the grumbling arose. The commandant had returned to the office of the week's adjutant next to the police station. There he was literally besieged. Everyone called out to him, shouting that if the sergeant wasn't permitted to go on leave, none of us would go. Seized by a violent rage, the officer appeared at a window, brow furrowed, giving us a look that should have silenced us. But faced with equally fierce expressions, he detected such a level of hostility that he judged it prudent to yield. "Let him go," he said. "This sergeant will serve his punishment afterward." Nevertheless, when he came back from leave, the sergeant wasn't bothered at all. Throughout the companies, battalions and regiments, there were decent captains, commandants and colonels who were moved by these arbitrary punishments and demotions for the most petty and ridiculous reasons. They made themselves heard by vigorous complaints, which were mainly useless. This commandant, our so-called morale booster, was imposed on us by the High Command. He was just carrying out the inflexible orders he had received. Once they decided that we had been sufficiently disciplined, beaten down, choked, they relieved us of this undesirable personage. He was named a lieutenant colonel somewhere. He had really earned this promotion. During our stay in this sector, I twice went on relaxation leave. I noted that in the rear, The wild enthusiasm of the start of the war had given way to complete indifference. Each person had arranged his life with the goal of realizing the most well-being and profits. If you approached a group conversing among themselves, whether in a cafe, a station, or any other place, you heard talk about everything except the war. Everyone was so habituated to it, they had stopped caring about it. The price of wine soared to new heights, bringing huge profits to those who could till their vineyards. The war was no longer considered a scourge. From time to time you heard that the son of so-and-so or the husband of what's-her-name had been killed, blown to bits, burned to a crisp, smashed, suffocated, up there in the distant trenches. But these inevitable deaths were considered the price to be paid, in ransom for general prosperity, as we awaited the final victory. Except for home leaves, no one from our group ever left the trenches as part of battalions being sent to the rear for rest, because there weren't enough of us to be relieved. For almost 6 months we lived in the Argonne woods, cut off from the rest of the world. These 6 months of exile were, for me, interrupted by 2 stints of 10 days each, when I went to Camp Soumiat, near Saint-Menehould, for ballistics training. For me, my instruction consisted of sticking paper on the targets and having them brought and set up on the firing range. That's all I learned how to do. One November day, we were near our little fortress, busy cutting up an oak tree for firewood, when Sergeant Gautier, coming back from the kitchens, announced some surprising news. The 296th Regiment was being dissolved and was going to be dispersed among the units of a Breton regiment which had just been decimated in the Bois-le-Chaume, north of Verdun. This news got various welcomes in the regiment, with pleasure by those who for 6 months had been shuttling between the outposts and the miserable reserve dugouts, from which by night they went out to place barbed wire and haul other material on their shoulders. This dissolution was an unhoped-for windfall, a getaway from the trenches for a few days. Who knew for how long? A nice rest before winter's cold set in, perhaps? But for those who had a comfortable assignment, the dutiful orderly, the greasy cook, the comfortable bicyclist, all the way up to the payroll clerk and the quartermaster, the news brought uncertainty, the fear of losing their cushy jobs. Clearly, there were reasons for this dissolution. The role played by the 296th in the anti-militarist demonstrations of last June was probably not unrelated to the disgrace which fell upon us. The 296th Regiment was also the regiment headquartered at Béziers. Béziers, where in 1907, at the time of the wine growers' protests, the regiment had mutinied. Who didn't know the stirring tale of this regiment, the 17th Infantry, which, under the command of a corporal braving the thunderbolts of discipline and the anger of the tiger himself, Clemenceau, then in power, dared to stand in line of battle against the troops of General Lacroixard? Well, a few days before our dissolution, Clemenceau rose to power again. I should say dictatorial power. Did he fear that in the 296th Regiment there were some former mutineers of the 17th Regiment who, like some evil yeast, might stir up some incidents, protests, demonstrations against the return to power of the former butcher of the Midi? It's possible that such fears inspired in our top cop the idea of getting rid of us, but if that's what he meant to do, he was curiously mistaken. The 296th Regiment had become an amalgam, within which were represented almost all of our provincial races. Only a very small number now hailed from the region of Béziers, and even rarer were those who had not forgotten the memory of the tragic events of 1907. Nevertheless, there was still the corporal who, for a few days back then, had taken the place of the colonel of the 17th Regiment, which didn't keep him from now being signals sergeant. His name was Fondacave. On November 16th, the news of our dissolution spread widely, and on the 19th, our group, with the last remaining elements, left La Harazie, where we had spent such a peaceful 6 months, and where we would have happily remained until the war's end. But now we had to embark on new journeys. We went to rejoin the regiment near the village of Florent, at the Darnyville encampment, made up of barracks hidden in the middle of the woods. This was a stroll of more than 20 kilometres, because the officer who was guiding us rode a bicycle and preferred riding on the main road to bumping along a country lane, so they had us make a big, useless detour to Moiremont. This preference cost our legs 4 or 5 more kilometres. But what the hell? Foot soldiers are made for walking, just like birds are for flying and fish for swimming. At Darneyville, the first to arrive had, as was their right, occupied the best barracks and even the bad ones, since 3 battalions had to camp where there was enough room for only 1. It was impossible to find even a little bit of room for us, and since there were no hotels at the Darneyville camp, we had to find places under the trees to spend the night. A cold, freezing night, but luckily without rain or snow. We could even light some campfires with brush, branches, dead wood, and even live wood, which warmed us up a bit. The next day they handed out flyers with the farewells of our division's general. It was written in emotional terms, recalling all our exploits from Vermelles and Lorette all the way to the Argonne. There was reference to the events of last June, but the sponge had wiped clean the misdeeds of the 296th Regiment. The general declared himself highly satisfied with its loyal and proper attitude, and said that it had resisted being dragged into the defeatist campaign. That was a good point. The general couldn't ignore what had happened, but he was politically savvy enough to pretend to ignore it. Dinner eaten, the regiment assembled for its departure. It was with no regrets that I left this inhospitable camp, where I had shivered all night long under an oak tree. Trucks came to get us, but because we faced an interminable slope which would no doubt have required too great an expenditure of gasoline, we had to walk for more than an hour to reach them. Covered with sweat, we arrived at the place where the trucks were lined up, right next to Sainte-Menehould. And by unknown roads we left, a joyless journey because, after having perspired, now we froze, shivering with cold inside the trucks, devoid of any comfort, open to every breeze and cold draught. Around 3 in the afternoon, the trucks stopped in the middle of the countryside. They made us climb down. Right then, the battalion's leaders, by confidential written orders, got word to convey their units to various surrounding locales. Why so much mystery, so many precautions about our moves? What were they so afraid of that they didn't dare bring the whole regiment together again, one final time, for a big sensational parade and review, as is usually done in those situations? That served to bolster the suspicion that the regiment was in disgrace and being punished. They treated us like dangerous men, or at least suspects, and that chilled our dignity. We were indifferent to anything that didn't regard home leaves and peace. As for everything else, the soldiers couldn't give a damn. Our battalion got the order to go to the village of Bassuet, and we set out along the roadway like a flock of sheep heading for the fairground. Soon there arrived officers from various units, flanked by aides and sergeant majors making their choices. In the blink of an eye, by sections, by squads, by whole companies, everything was taken away, disappeared, and only our group remained. Night fell, and the roadway, where a sharp bice was blowing, sweeping up all the dead leaves, was completely deserted. Nobody wanted us. We were abandoned. Our Sub-Lieutenant Laureus was furious. He set out to find the colonel of the 248th Regiment, part of which was billeted in the village, and he explained the strange fate of 32 soldiers from the 296th Regiment, in distress, without anything to eat, left on the public highway. The colonel was willing to take us into his regiment, provisionally. The next day he assigned us to a machine gun company and asked the billeting officer to take care of our lodging. That evening we had to go without supper. What had become of our field kitchen, with its hard-earned battle scars and wounds from combles, and our number 1 chef, Mauler, whose portrait I've already sketched in these notebooks, and who was awarded the Croix de Guerre for not having left his station under furious bombardments. As for our lodging, all the billets being occupied already, we had to resign ourselves to a spot at the edge of the village, in an old coach house which no one else had wanted, because the roof was busted through in 20 places, and 100 draughts seeped through chinks in the wattle and daub walls. The flooring consisted of bits of straw made rotten by the rain. Our blockhouse at La Harazie was a palace compared to this hovel. Although shells and bullets fell upon Bassuet only rarely, the rain and the snow during our stay there came several times each night, forcing us to flee the drainpipes and seek out a drier corner somewhere. To our great amazement, that very evening, a tailor was sent to cut off the badges of the 296th and to sew on, in their place, those of the 248th Regiment. Why this haste? Couldn't they wait until the next day? Was the number 296 so damning that they had to scrub it off like garbage? If they had known how indifferent we were about it, there would have been less of a rush. No matter what regiment you were in, you were still in the clutches of militarism. We were thus assigned provisionally to the 4th Battalion of the 248th, awaiting the final determination of our fate at a higher level. The day after we arrived, the commandant of this battalion felt the need to make our acquaintance, but I'd never seen a review like this one. We left the billet in single file. The commandant at the gate stared at each one of us like a butcher inspects a flock of sheep at his barnyard's gate. After we'd lined up in front of the billet, he repeated his inspection, stopping at length in front of each man, to whom he posed a few questions about his conscription class, his recruitment, etc. Why did he look at us like strange beasts? What reputation had they pinned on us? When he stopped in front of me, he said, "You're a skinny one, you." I kept my mouth shut. "Why are you so skinny?" "Commandant, when you don't miss a hitch in the trenches for 36 months, you can hardly get fat." The commandant's voice softened. He turned to our Lieutenant Laureus and said, "All your men look good, but you have this corporal who's worn out. Take care of him." This certainly wasn't our former Commandant Quinza Grams, showing interest in whether I was too skinny or too tired. This was the first kind-hearted word that a superior officer had said to me since I'd been at the front. That's why I've made note of it. One evening, in a large structure, a troupe of artists, real artists, came to Bassuet to give a performance. There were female artists in this troupe. That's all that was needed to bring hundreds of poilus running from all the neighbouring villages. The Brigadier General himself attended, sitting in the front row, as you'd imagine. It's only in the trenches that the poilu gets a front row seat. The 248th Regimental Band was the orchestra. The young pretty girls were a huge hit. Half naked, decked out in jewels, they cut capers, danced, sang songs, performed saucy skits. Transported, excited, the poilus stamped, clapped, and roared with laughter. Ah, this French insouciance, this joy, this laughter. Weren't they an insult to the hundreds of dead bodies left by the division in the mud of the sinister Bois-le-Chaume? The earth hadn't yet soaked up all their blood, and their comrades who had seen them fall were now letting themselves go like this, having fun, getting drunk on songs, music, and off-colour jokes. There were also speeches and patriotic songs, which were a little less well received. I didn't wait for the end of the performance to return to my hovel. A few comrades who shared my heartache did the same. I even know some who had the dignity not to attend the show at all. After a week at Bassuet, the fate of our group was finally handed down. We were to be dispersed into various units of the division. As for me, I was kept in the 248th Regiment, which had its headquarters in Guingamp, in the Brittany. I was assigned to the 18th Company, in a battalion located in the village next to Bassuet, which I joined on November 29th with 3 comrades, including my friend Fraisse from Olonzac, who were attached to other companies. Well, we didn't feel like singing La Madelon as we marched along. We didn't see anything worthwhile about being incorporated into a regiment of Bretons. "Did anyone think about that?" said Fraisse, usually so jovial. "About putting us with such grumpy, stubborn, buttoned-up, melancholy folks? I'll give them the slip pretty soon." He was lucky enough to have a patch of chronic eczema on one leg, which had already gotten him evacuated 3 times. Now, during a rest stop, he showed it to us. It was starting to soften, to scab up, to form a sore. "Soon it will be done just right," he said, "to take to the major medical officer." In peacetime you would have felt sorry for someone afflicted with such eczema. Now we envied him for it, this lucky Fraisse. Convallo, convalescent hospital, and then a trip back to home base brought the prospect of 2 or 3 months of rest. I had the bad luck to be the only one from our group and the only one from the 296th to be assigned to this 18th Company, where I would find only foreign faces. While other companies had been almost completely wiped out, the 18th Company had suffered only a few losses, which had already been made up for with replacements from the rear. The whole 296th Regiment was insufficient to rebuild the division from that disaster which had passed unnoticed in a banal communiqué covering reciprocal raids, clashes of patrols, major artillery activity in the Bois-le-Chaume. In peacetime, a chimney fire would have gotten more notice in local news columns than did this massacre which covered Brittany in mourning. At the office of the 18th Company, where I presented myself, they gave me command of the 15th Squad. Off I went in search of this phantom squad, which I couldn't discover in any of the billets occupied by the company. I immediately found that the Breton soldiers, figuring out from my accent alone that I wasn't one of their own, looked at me with suspicion and weren't at all interested in giving me any information. I nevertheless learned that the company took its meals in premises converted to a mess hall. This innovation made for a veritable luxury. It was the first time since I'd been at the front, since 1914, that I'd seen benches and tables put to use by poilus for eating their meals. For sure, this dining room's furniture consisted only of rough, rickety benches, wobbly tables, all as rudimentary as could be. Up on the ceiling were plenty of cobwebs, and this room was well ventilated, too well ventilated, in fact, by numerous draughts. But in the end it made for progress, all the same. At supper time it was therefore easy for me to find the 15th Squad, represented by a grand total of 2 Bretons, who greeted me with unintelligible grunts. They were completely drunk, and had been for 3 days, it appeared. They weren't the only ones, and I saw that very first day the passion of the Bretons for alcohol and wine, which led them to drunkenness every time they had the means and the opportunity. A Breton would have thought to be dishonouring Brittany if he didn't have a pipe or a quid of tobacco in his mouth, and I noticed with disgust that almost all of them were covered with vermin. The ticks don't have a preference, a marked predilection for the skin of a Breton compared to that of a Parisian or an Auvergnat. Nevertheless, it wasn't completely the men's fault. In the 248th, they distributed clean clothes so rarely that most of the men possessed only what they were wearing. The Bretons are stubborn, quarrelsome, pugnacious, unsociable only when their minds are disturbed by the vapours of wine or other fermented potion. Outside of this abnormal state, the Bretons are as soft as sheep, as valiant and courageous as ancient Gauls, good-hearted and devoted. The rest of the 15th Squad was either away on leave or had been sent out in agricultural work teams. The higher-ups were starting to understand that it was more useful to put men to work in the fields than parading them around or having them amuse themselves by knocking sticks together or playing leapfrog. I learned with delight that among the leave-takers was a southerner. This was the company's barber. He was from Auch. I would have at least one person with whom I could bond. But while waiting for him, I spent several lonely days without a single comrade, in the midst of indifferent, if not hostile folks, speaking an incomprehensible language. To make matters worse, the section chief was an old sub-lieutenant who lived by the rule-book and followed it to the letter. 10 times a day he visited our billets, multiplying the inspections, parades, and roll calls. What a difference from our good old sub-lieutenant Lorius, who outside of his duties in the trenches, never bothered us with all the things he could have done to make our lives miserable. I needed to be brought into line. This maniacal officer saw that right away, and from the first day he was after me. Sometimes it was my shoes not properly shined, or the billet not in order, or the squad not at full strength at roll call. One day I lost my patience, and I answered this officer who had just given me a snide comment. "Lieutenant, I'm asking you to speak to me in a more polite tone. You're my superior, but that doesn't excuse you. You don't have the right to speak to me rudely. Show me some respect if you want me to respect you." The officer, to whom I, taciturn and solitary, had spoken only when constrained and forced to do so, no doubt thought I was a near idiot. He seemed stupefied by my brusque statement. "But," he said, nonplussed, "the chore that I assigned to you was badly done. I've done my best. If you think you have to punish me, that's up to you and your conscience. Go ahead, punish me." I have to admit that he didn't end up punishing me, and to tell the truth, he hardly ever punished anyone. He even showed himself to be indulgent and affectionate toward his men. It was said that he had proven his courage and his sang-froid. In my section, the men held him in high regard, and they supported his obsessions without grumbling too much. Personally, he left me alone from that day on, and subsequently even showed me some kindness. In spite of the snow covering the ground and the sharp cold, we went out on exercises every day, during which, to amuse us, they had us run races and play games. You can imagine what fun we had. Meanwhile, the division was brought back to strength. We were ready to head back to the trenches. They couldn't let the soldiers spend too much time in the rear, getting soft. On December 5th, we left Bassouet, conveyed to the front by automobile. The cold was downright Siberian. The thermometer hovered around 12 degrees below 0 Celsius. Travelling in vans covered with canvas full of holes, immobile, tightly packed, we really had to be as hardy as cavemen to not succumb to the cold. But we were immunised. The next day there were no more visitors than usual to sick call. At nightfall the vans dropped us near the village of Senadies, where the regiment was billeted. Our company was billeted in a hamlet with its name inscribed on a touring club sign, the inspection post. Funny name. I wonder what they had to inspect in this agglomeration of 5 or 6 houses lost in the middle of the woods. We didn't stay long at La Contrôlerie. The next day, after soup, we headed for the trenches. We passed through Les Islettes, Le Neufour, Le Clan, and La Chalade along the valley of the Biesme, which flowed on to La Harazée at the foot of our sorely missed little fort, where we had been barely 17 days ago. All these villages we passed through, except the last one, La Chalade, were still partly inhabited despite their proximity to the front lines, because they were protected by the wooded escarpments of the valley. At nightfall they stuck us in the front lines. This installation consisted of taking possession of a few tiny shelters or individual dugouts carved into the trench walls. They were shored up with wood. Once you got into one, you could stretch out but not sit up, because the ceiling was too low. You were well protected from an ordinary shell, but not from the cold, which was so rigorous that it would have been imprudent to let yourself fall off to sleep. Wandering around a bit, I noted that some sections were better lodged than we were, while others were worse off. I had to do 12 hours on guard duty out of 24, from noon to midnight, which was fine with me. They kindly let us corporals decide among ourselves. That way each of us had about 7 hours of nighttime duty. Take note of this. 7 hours of walking along the muddy boyau, a blanket draped over your shoulders, hurried along by a glacial bice or by rain or snow in this chilly Argonne. 7 hours of tramping the deserted trenches where you might still have an unlucky encounter. Sometimes German patrols infiltrated between listening posts and pounced upon a solitary wanderer. Or maybe it would be a French officer making his speedy rounds, eagerly telling you that at such and such a post the sentinels weren't on the lookout, or catching you taking a break on the steps of some dugout. You had to go from one outpost to another, where, at the end of a sap, 2 sentinels, huddled, curled up, immobile, waited for the hour of their relief with the passivity of beasts of burden. Most of the time they weren't even watching. Numbed by the cold, they dozed off. Every 2 hours I had to wake up the relief teams, and I had to listen over and over to their complaints and their curses against the war. But in the end they got up. Sometimes, chased by the cold or just to shirk their duty, some sought shelter at the mouth of a nearby mineshaft. Then we had to mount a veritable manhunt in the dark shadows. Those damned corporal's stripes. How I envied the men of the squad, those guys who could, once their 2 hours of watch were over, burrow into a hole, quietly, without any responsibilities. This went on for 8 days and nights. It would have lasted longer if the men hadn't raised loud complaints which were transmitted to our captain by our sergeant, a lawyer, going to plead our case before courts-martial and earning wide influence in our company command. They led us 200 metres back from the front line, into a deep and spacious shelter with a wire mesh cot for each one of us. They were really spoiling us. As was the rule, we had work details from morning to evening, but at night they were generous enough to leave us alone. Our main job was to bring rations up to the men on the front lines. The field kitchens were nearby, at the bottom of a ravine, or you could call it a precipice, next to which we were posted. You reached the bottom by a staircase which counted 500 steps, not one less, and they were poilu steps, 50 to 80 centimetres each one. You couldn't be asthmatic and climb this gigantic staircase. It wasn't too hard in dry weather, But when the snow and ice and slick mud covered the steps, watch out for slippery spots. You had to grab onto roots and rocky outcroppings so as not to tumble all the way to the bottom. And the Bosch lines weren't even 100 meters from the last step of this staircase. Our outposts were only a few steps away from them. Along the bottom of this deep valley, there was room just for a little tributary of the Biesme, and for a road which must have been an enchanting hiking trail up until a certain day in 1915, when the front lines were fixed there. On this sheltered road, you could have thought yourself perfectly safe. But alas, the Bosch gunners found a way, by plunging fire, to rain their shells right onto the stream or the road, and our field kitchens had to seek shelter in a sharp curve of the valley or in sorts of grottos which they had to dig. But these artillerymen were wizards. Bombs, shells, mortar rounds often poured down with a thunderous racket right up to the entrances of these grottos. On December 14th, our battalion left the front lines and went into reserve 1 kilometre to the rear, in large shelters, in the middle of the woods, near the forester's cottage, of which not a trace remained. Bloody combats had taken place in this area. Those who had fallen there slept their eternal sleep in a vast cemetery, which grew every day with the dead from this sector.